Okay, so thank you three so much for joining us this evening, and I'd like to start by asking you, we'd like to hear from you how you have been involved in law reform addressing violence against women. So Saxon, perhaps we'll start with you and your involvement in law reform in this space.
Sure. So briefly touched on it in my introduction. So after my assault, I came forward with my story, and the New South Wales Attorney General decided to refer the section of the law that deals with consent to the New South Wales Law Reform Commission. I kind of didn't really, have a huge amount of input in that, other than, I put in a submission as just an individual during the first round of submissions. And sort of during the Law Reform Commission's deliberation phase after that, was when Rachael and I connected on Twitter and did some panels together, and sort of really, honed in my focus on advocacy and kind of what that meant for me. And so Rachael, along with our other colleague, Professor Jonathan Crowe, were really instrumental in helping me understand the ways that the law interacts with survivors in sort of a, this theory sense, rather than, I obviously understood the practicalities of what it looks like, but, where a certain clause sits means that it does something different, and, all these like intricacies that a layperson wouldn't really understand. So when I started working with Rachael and John, that was really when we got super involved in the campaign to make sure that New South Wales really took on this law reform in the right way and didn't just kind of, do another tick box exercise. So that's kind of how we got into it.
So thank you so much for sharing that, Saxon. Noelle, would you like to share with us your experiences in being involved with law reform?
Right, so I was involved in law reform in New South Wales, Western Australia, and at the Commonwealth level to help criminalise image-based sexual abuse in those jurisdictions. I never set out to speak out or to be involved in law reform. In fact, it was never something that I imagined would be my life, or that it would be what I would have to do. But it was the result and the culmination of a number of factors that that had motivated and almost forced me to speak out, which was there wasn't any specific laws that dealt with the issue at the time. My name needed to be reclaimed because of this misappropriation of my body, my name, my image that was being done by perpetrators, and I needed to reclaim my name by speaking out publicly and also fighting for justice. And also because there were so many people that were experiencing this that didn't know as much about it, and it wasn't really dominating the media cycle as it does today. So I was involved in speaking out, and I put that in the same kind of glove as being involved in law reform, because of those reasons. And so that's what I did in those jurisdictions.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Noelle. Rachael, could you share your experience?
I feel like Saxon stole half my answer. So Saxon and I became can confirm friends on Twitter, really, because we both were sort of tweeting about the New South Wales Law Reform Commission review, and I was doing that sort of at the end of / out of my PhD, and then we sort of got chucked on a couple of panels together. In fact, DV New South Wales conference panel, and I guess the rest is history. We decided that we really were advocating for the same goal, had the same concerns, and that I guess we each had strengths that we thought we could really contribute to something meaningful together. And with our other colleague John, who Saxon mentioned before, John Crowe, who's a professor of law at University of Wollongong, we sort of worked together to do that, and we started RASARA, Rape and Sexual Assault Research and Advocacy, to, I guess, what really it was like to become a bit more legit, and to be like, yeah, this cluster of people has this name, and we're bringing this forward. And at the time, we just thought it was going to be like a little way that we spoke about ourselves and each other, but particularly through that Law Reform Commission process, we ended up having quite a bit of, I'll say, success. So,
Thank you so much for sharing your journeys.
And when you have been involved in a law reform process, do you feel that you have been listened to? Do you feel that you've been heard? Noelle?
So, do I feel like I've been heard in a certain law reform context? I think there's so many layers to this question and so many parts to it. So there's issues of was I talking about and fighting for things that was in alignment with what the government or what was the agenda of the day? Was it, and so in that case, I might have been heard. Was I challenging or criticising what the policy agenda might have been? And in that case, you're erased and you're not heard. So there's different layers to that question. And there's been instances where, I will be involved in a parliamentary inquiry. So there was recently one on the anti-trolling inquiry. And they were looking at proposed legislation to try and unmask people online who had been, I guess, trolling others and finding out who they are if they were under the mask of anonymity. And so I was on this panel, and it's to my knowledge that I was the only person who the committee did not quote or did not cite in their 200-something page report. And they had an entire section on image-based sexual abuse, and I was not included at all in this part. And I gave evidence and testimony in the inquiry about my experiences. And so, they had gone and quoted every other survivor that gave evidence, but not me. And it's things like this that you have to experience that isn't going to spark an outrage or a big media frenzy. So you just have to cop it because it's insignificant and it really only impacts me. So am I heard? Depends on the context. And in other contexts, I'm completely erased despite the work I do. So that's what you're up against.
I think some interesting points there, Noelle, about the context, and I think it's certainly how you're received depends on the goals of the people you're meeting with. And for those of us here today who've heard some of the panels, sorry for the people online who haven't, but we've heard about sort of different conceptualizations of what listening is. So is listening about having the potential to change an opinion. That is probably true. I think our experience in at least New South Wales was certainly sometimes being heard, sometimes certainly not being heard. But I think it also, I think this is why we decided to sort of band together as Rasara. That is like a way for us to kind of, barge through some of those blockades, that we're coming together as a collection of survivor experts and other experts, that I think that gets us past a lot of doors and gets us to a point where perhaps some of those issues we don't need as much, but also I think this is all occurring in the context of these other practices that might not be related to the person or the people or the group that you're talking to or speaking to. But for example, in New South Wales, because we're talking about that context, but Mark Speakman, the Attorney General, was until recently also the Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Sexual Violence, and then he dropped sexual violence from his portfolio, from the title of his portfolio. Of course, it still fell within the scope of his role, but again, we're seeing this sort of language of sexual violence really being erased. So when that happens, that's frustrating for us. And we're like, we're literally in meetings with you, and having these conversations and telling you this is the impact, and you are also promising, after you've pretty much been called out, right? Promising to reform these problematic laws, but then this happens, and how does that fit in with your kind of broader approach you're taking. I don't know if Saxon wants to add to that.
Well, I think I agree with you both that it's very much, yes, sometimes they listen when it is convenient for them, they are listening, and when it doesn't fit, then they can close their ears to it. But I think we definitely found that there were times when the Attorney General of New South Wales was so attentive and so in tune to what we were saying that I was genuinely shocked. Like, we came to meetings where he had read all, like, Rachael and John's paper about they had written, that he'd read articles, and he came in with like these newspaper clippings like he was a madman. And it was just like, this is what really engaging in that idea we heard earlier of listening to not only what we're saying, but the context of what we're saying and the whole picture of it. And then, we had other experiences like in Queensland where they got a bunch of survivors in a room, traumatized them all for a day, and then said, there's coffee outside, and that was it. They didn't even mention it in their paper. So there's very, wildly varying rates of being listened to.
I think you've picked up on the next question that we. I think that you've raised some really interesting points in that last question around the convenience, and when it's convenient to be listened to, and when we may prefer to ignore you or have it swept under the rug. And I wonder if the three of you might like to reflect on the decisions that you've made to particularly engage with some of the senior actors, like the Attorney General, for example. What was it that led you to want to actually, sort of bypass some of the other processes and just go straight to the heart of the problem? So Rachel, I wonder if you could start by maybe sort of having some reflections on
Rage. I rage emailed the Federal Attorney General the other week, and he's agreed to meet us, so that worked. But look, Saxon kind of had a relationship with Mark Speakman because of the kind of way that consent was referred to the Law Reform Commission. But it's kind of it's the easiest person, right? It's the person who's in charge of that. So if you can get there, go for it. And I think we've had some success, certainly. New South Wales. A lot of success there in terms of sexual consent law reform. We've had success in relation to Let Us Speak in Victoria and Northern Territory. I wasn't involved in the Tasmanian Let Her Speak, which is of course a campaign that supported and helped Grace Tame sort of claim back her right to her own identity, which we talk for another time. But I think it's just as important to reflect on the fact that hasn't always been successful for us. And, Let Us Speak in Victoria is actually a really good example of that, because we tried to just go to the then Attorney General, Jill Hennessy, and she just didn't want to borrow it. So we're like, well, we didn't really want to do a whole thing. And there were a lot of work, these campaigns. So we were just hoping we could just point it out, and then that would fix it. And it just didn't, of course, as we know. So we had to go the whole rigmarole, and that, for us, it's like the decision-making process of launching a campaign like that. We know it drags survivors through hell. Like, it, for everybody, that affects everybody. Like, in the wake of all this news media about, I think it's fair to call it the trial of Brittany Higgins, which is what we saw. Like, that's traumatizing to survivors. And we know that is the case, so it's not your first port of call by any stretch. That's why you go straight to the AGs, because if we don't have to take survivors to this horrible kind of media frenzy of it, that's the best approach. So just get it done without any harm. But unfortunately, it's not always. Sometimes you need the power of the people and the power of survivors, even though it's harmful and it hurts. And that's what we need to do with us, at least in Victoria.
Saxon, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think what spurred us to sort of rage on the New South Wales Attorney General, and Rachael, I did have a relationship with the Attorney General's office, but we had never, had a meeting. It was just sort of, thank you for your story, that's what we're going to do type of situation. But, we had that initial connection. And so the New South Wales Law Reform Commission actually ended up, their final report was they didn't recommend affirmative consent laws. And basically they said they had listened to the, New South Wales Bar Association, who said it would be really bad for perpetrators, so they weren't going to do it. And we were just like, after hearing all of these submissions, they had a record number of submissions about this. They had so much evidence base of why they should do this. And we were now out of options with the Law Reform Commission. And so we just thought, well, we can't make it worse by going to the Attorney General. So we may as well just try and, meet with him. We met with him, we met with the Shadow Attorney General of New South Wales, we met with anybody who picked up the phone and said yes. And yeah,
Most of them didn't.
yeah. A lot of people didn't answer the phone. But when we met with Mark Speakman, he was genuinely interested in learning our point of view and genuinely interested in listening to us and being willing to have his mind changed.
At least in that meeting.
Yeah,
In that meeting.
not all the meetings.
Yeah.
I'm not a big Mark Speakman fan. I think it's
No.
fine. I don't want to sit anywhere politically. I'm just he's all right guy.
But yeah, certainly not. Other meetings were not the same.
Right.
Vibe.
But at least in that moment, I think to draw on Tanya's presentation before he offered hospitality.
Yeah.
He was like really prepared for the meeting, like personally prepared. Came with a big folder and opened it up, and it was very scary. Had all the articles I've ever written, just not that many, but anyway, over there with post-it notes and scribbles in the margins. So, and we walked over like, did we just get cross-examined? But then he like emailed us, or I can't even remember how it happened. Actually, I think Bree Lee interviewed him, and then she called us and she was like, "Oh, he loved you guys. He thought you were great," and yeah. So it was kind of scary, but survived.
Great. Noelle, would you like to share your
Just
reflections?
following on that, I also had a great experience with Mark Speakman. Just keep, I said you need loyalty. I did a press conference with him outside the law courts in New South Wales, and this was the first time. It was actually the start of my healing journey, the way he responded to what had happened to me, because without asking or without any prompt, he stood on the floor of the New South Wales Parliament and mentioned me directly in the second reading speech, and thanked me for my advocacy. And it was like, oh my goodness, for the first time ever, a person in a position of power had recognised the work and also had gone out of the way to actually say that in Parliament. And I was not expecting it, and it was very emotional because I was sitting in the public gallery at the time, and it was so powerful just to hear that acknowledgement from a person in power, because even though the laws that were introduced would not do absolutely anything for me, a lot of the abuse had happened prior to the laws being introduced, but even still they wouldn't help me post that, because a lot of what's happened to me has happened all over. I guess it's not necessarily happening in Australia. We don't know who the perpetrators are. There's a global nature and element to this. And I don't know who's responsible. So you're limited by those circumstances. But even though the laws weren't actually going to help me at all in practice, the very fact of the hospitality or the, just the willingness to see someone as human was very powerful. So, I mean, they've already said everything else on the question.
No, that's really, I think, a really important part is being able to recognise the other as well, and to be able to recognise the humanity, the needs, the interests of the other, and to meet them as an equal and to offer them political, legal subjectivity.
Yeah. And I think my question is really carries on from that, and you've each preempted it in some respects. And my question is about, how do you see an effective listener in a law reform process? You mentioned preparation, you've drawn on that idea of hospitality we were discussing, you mentioned that openness to being persuaded. Is there anything else that you can suggest from your experience makes a good listener in that context?
Okay. I think, and like just just to clarify on Mark's speaking, like, I think he gets a lot of credit because of like current AGs. He's the one that met with us most, but I don't think that the totality of him is a good listener. That meeting had elements of good listening practice, but we also, during the sort of parliamentary debate, we emailed and said, look, you know, we urgently want to talk to you about this thing that's made into this bill. And he came really combative to that meeting with a bunch of hypotheticals that always magically, you know, fall on the side of rapists. And you know, we have just had this line we always say, like, we're not dealing with hypotheticals. Like, name any case ever where that has happened and that's been the result of how the law's been applied. And oh well, no, it's just, you know, there's no answer for it. Like it's always like some kind of vague kind of, oh, but it might happen, or it's just not the reality of the lived experience of sexual violence. So what makes a good listener? I don't know. I think it's just more than, I don't think we've experienced a good listener. We've definitely experienced good practices of listening. I don't know.
Well, I think part of like something that I think a lot of politicians don't think about is this idea of like trauma-informed engagement. And trauma-informed is something that we just say now, like that doesn't mean anything, but it, you know, it has a real meaning and what that really looks like. And I think that is not often how politicians engage, even with survivors or with advocates or whoever. And I think that's a really important part of being able to listen, is being able to create that safe space to give, you know, to receive that information and for someone to give that information. So I think that's something that is really often overlooked. But yeah, like there are aspects of meetings that we've had that have included, but you know, good listening and what that might look like. But that, you know, for most of our experiences, it has been a moment where there has been good listening. It hasn't been, you know, the entire experience I felt hurt.
Yeah, so on the point of what is effective listening and what makes a good listener, I think the previous session was really great framework, great thoughts about the politics of listening. I just want to expand on that a little bit from my perspective of listening and effective listening, which is really looking at the politics. I really do want to echo that, because there are so many layers to the general issue of whether or not you're heard, or how you're heard, or who's heard. I mean, there's issues to do with, do you say the things that the government wants to hear? Do you say it in a way that's nice and sweet and polite, or are you angry? Are you, I guess, an ideal victim kind of mold? Are you a white woman who's saying that? Or are you like a brown woman? What clothes are you wearing? How do you appear? That all impacts on how you're heard, and if you're heard at all. What do you do for a living? Like what's your educational background? And like I think particularly I want to emphasize is, what are you saying? Because I've found that if I have gone against the grain, or if I've challenged anything, so if I was anything other than one-dimensional, if I had critical thinking, or if I wanted to say something that wasn't, again, what they wanted me to say, then I would get so much pushback. So unless there is a real clarity on what it takes to be heard, then we can't really get to the point of, and again, I'm probably repeating a lot of the stuff, of effective listening, because it's all of those elements, and there's, you know, the racial elements and gender elements and yeah, so all of those aspects.
Yeah, I think you raised some really interesting points about the kind of curation of the self when engaging in a process like this as well. To what extent you present certain parts of yourself. Again, I think too, we were talking earlier about the different narratives that you might tell and the way that the law requires you to tell some things and not other things, and that there's always going to be a process of obscurement and visibility. And that also comes down to who you are as a person, right? And to what extent that might impact the listening itself. I wonder if you could talk about perhaps listening beyond the institutional processes that you've engaged with as well, in terms of listening, like a public listening, as Tanya was mentioning earlier, in terms of your experiences of listening beyond just a law reform process or a law reform engagement. Rach, maybe did you want to go first?
I reckon it's Saxon. No, because I mean, that's the essence of what really, before we teamed up, was what your experience was really about. Sorry,
Well, yeah, I think my experience is quite rare, I think, in that I was quite soundly listened to and felt that way. I think it starts even, before the episode of Four Corners came out. The fact that Four Corners even wanted to do an episode with me really speaks to kind of the parts of my story that are palatable. And I think my story has a lot of really palatable aspects to it, in the fact that, most obviously I'm white and young, and but the actual, assault, I was very young. I, had not been out drinking much, so there was no, nothing like that. I was a virgin, so, there were absolutely no other factors. There was nothing outside that would kind of say, oh, but what about this? I truly embodied that perfect victim ideology. And so it was easy to do a story about an assault like that. So, from the get-go, that's why Four Corners even approached me about this. And then again, that is why it becomes a palatable story. So I think I did feel really heard, but I think in being heard, I think it also spoke to the silence of why other people aren't listened to, and why other people aren't even chosen to be the subject of a story like that.
So I have to acknowledge some of the privileges that I have, and I too have been very lucky in terms of the media, where I have been heard in a lot of news media, documentaries, podcasts, in that kind of sphere. I definitely have had a voice. How much of it has been one-dimensional in terms of having a survivor story only centered, rather than what I do after or who I am? How much of it is, fully captured? Yeah, so again, fully capturing the essence of who I am, that's another question. So there is a lot of tokenism there, but I have to say, I have been privileged enough to have that opportunity to have that voice, and I know that there are many, many, many people who don't get that opportunity, who aren't heard, whose stories that we don't know about. So in that respect, I feel like that's important to note. But I have to make a point where that experience of the news media and being heard in that has not translated necessarily to the law reform aspect. And it's not translated because I think of the elements that we talked about before, where I don't necessarily fit the mold of who they would listen to usually and traditionally. And I found it particularly to be true in the online safety space. So we have a national regulator in this country, the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner. And coming from someone who has been probably the only person who has consistently and publicly advocated against image-based sexual abuse with a lived experience, and who has, in many ways been the public face of that specific issue. I've never ever once in the entire establishment of that office been included in anything been included in a conference, been included in a presentation, in terms of being in a panel or something, in a press conference or anything. And this is not because they don't include survivors. Yes, they do. Who do they include? People that do look like me, right? And not only that, I have tried to reach out to them and say, can we have a survivor committee, or can we have an advisory group of survivors? And that's fallen on deaf ears. And I've recently reached out to the Minister for Communications to ask for the establishment of a survivor group, or a online safety task force that centres our stories and our voices so we can all be heard, because currently we're not being heard, and there's a lot of gatekeepers who are speaking for us about issues that directly impact us. And so we'll see what the result is from that, but that just goes to show the disparity between the different contexts. So if it's decision-making context or an institutional context, you know, where decisions are being made, that's totally different to the other spheres of life.
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing your experiences. Rachel, is there anything you'd like to add, maybe perhaps on like the research and advocacy?
Yeah, that's
front?
what I was thinking.
Yeah.
So I guess I kind of get to occupy a really different space than you two do. In that, like, these little tags, right? You know, PhD in your name kind of gets you some sort of automatic expert status. I mean, Saxon has to earn hers every time. Like, people always are like, oh, Rachel, do you want to explain the law things? I'm like, oh, actually, Saxon knows this part better. It's this part's her bit, right? You know, like that's the thing. The steps. And also I sort of, as the kind of current lead of this organisation, like I get to sort of occupy this space between these two roles that offers me, I think it gets me a seat at the table. But I will say, and this kind of circles back to Sarah, your question about physical listening. I actually think from a collective Rosara perspective, our good listeners are people like DB, New South Wales, right? Renata emails me all the time, and like we check in, and like that's good. Like that's that it's lending, you know, that you guys come to us and go, oh, you know, what's your perspective on this, and let's have a conversation, and it might not be like let's align. It's like let's talk about from different perspectives and different experiences where we, you know, where we meet on these issues. So that's really good. And also some politicians like Jenny Leong, who's a member for Newtown, who in New South Wales is a legend, and certainly, you know, was messaging us during the debate, checking in on Saxon, and because obviously it's a lot. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think I'm lucky I can be on Twitter and like, I mean, yeah, sometimes I get trolls on Twitter, but like not like some people, you know, so that part gives me a safer space. I don't know what safe means, but it's safer space than others to participate in this debate, and that's yeah, that's good.
And it's interesting to think about the privileges and hierarchies of knowledge as well. You know, that just because by virtue of having a PhD means that therefore you have better access to the seat of power, as opposed to those with lived experiences who are using that in order to initiate change. So I think that this maybe brings us to our final question for the panelists, and it's picking up on some of the questions I've been having coming through on the chat as well, and it's really about where to from here. So what strategies would you suggest for, you know, survivors in particular wanting to get involved in law reform moving forward? And I think more specifically as well, you know, how can we ensure that all survivors are being heard as well? So perhaps, Noelle, maybe you might like to reflect on that first, given the last point that you were raising before about who we do and don't listen to.
Right, so I have some very strong views that I think I don't really know how to track with them, because they might be a bit controversial. In terms of, I guess maybe what survivors might do if they want to get involved in the law reform process. I think we just have to have a lot of truth telling about what the cost is to survivors, because it is so easy to use those buzzwords of speak out, let's censor survivors, let's include them, and oftentimes when that happens, they are really fed to the wolves. They aren't supported. They don't get the outrage if something goes wrong. They don't get the help that they need. They're really just effectively used and exploited a lot of the times by many people and many institutions, by society at large. And then once they're done, we don't really hear from them after that time's passed, and they just, I guess, fuse into nothingness sometimes. Sometimes it feels like that. And so I think there just needs to be more truth telling about what really might happen if you do. And on the other side of that, and a bit of a hopeful note, it can also be very, very rewarding and really fulfilling and really brings you purpose in life. And you can make a real change if you want to go down that route. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. Rachael, would you like to add anything more reflections around, moving forward, what kind of work needs to be done?
Lots needs to be done. Of course, like we're talking about law reform today, but law reform is like this tiny part of a huge response to sexual violence that it certainly does not begin and end at criminal justice responses. It just happens to be a moment that we're able to and supported to have these conversations. And in large part because of people like Saxon and Noelle who bring these issues to the fore. I think one of the problems is that survivorhood is actually invisible unless you talk about it. We're really talking about public survivors. There's lots of survivors who work in this space and advocate in this space who aren't public survivors. So when we talk about engaging with survivors, we're really talking about how do we engage with more publicly known and willing to be identified and put on camera survivors. And that's the truth, and that's what media will tell you, because they don't want people to be anonymous. They want people to be like, okay, I want to do a photo shoot with you, and we'll put that up. And if you just want to be anonymous and we're not interested in the story, like that's a big part of it. So we work with the media, but we have the benefit of being an organised, well, especially we're an official charity, right? We're legit now, but we get to sort of count it within that. But journalists will, and I don't want to speak for Sax, but you work with a journalist who, on your story. Lots of journalists reach out to survivors and make them known to your platforms, and then, as you're saying, where do you go? We have to realise that working with survivors is work, and you owe them something if you're going to trot them out. And that's one of the big learnings from Let Us Speak. That's not just okay, we're finished with Let Us Speak Victoria, so see ya. No, these are lifelong relationships that we tend to and that are important. And I think when you're working with survivors, there's not an end date. The project might end, but there's not an end date, and that's really important. Saxon and I still work together. New South Wales and past the middle. I mean, we're not done yet. We're coming back. But it's and that's a positive thing too, because you forge really strong bonds. We're great friends and great colleagues for the most part. So that's really good. But there's a responsibility. We owe things to public survivors. Particularly if we're going to work with them or use their story. That's what journalists do a lot of the time. I'm not trying to drag journalists, but that's a problem.
They have claimed a lot of space in this area.
Yeah, it's a lot of space claimed by journalists, and some of that's legitimate, but we also need to account for the responsibility that these journalists then have. Does a journalist owe you something? Maybe. That's for you to worry about.
So Saxon, would you like to have the last word on what going forward, and then we'll open up to questions?
Yeah, I think, and going forward for people who want to get involved in this kind of thing, there are a million and one kind of on the ground collective organisations of people, especially, for young people, if you're at like a university or something like that, there's a lot of organisations, or Youth Survivors Against Violence. There are, I would suggest like joining a collective of people, because I think that's where the real power is. It's every so often there'll be a clash bang where one person is sort of able to create such a change. And that's not always the case. Most of the time it is just a lot of voices kind of raising this one issue up rather than the other way around. So I think, power is in numbers, definitely, which I think we are seeing. So yeah, I think there's a lot of collective power going on at the moment, and we'll just continue to see that grow.
You're getting a lot of affirmations of that online from the folks who are listening, and thank you for writing to say, yes, collective action is crucial. Thank you, Lisa. And I think there were a few questions about kind of things moving forward in the space, which I think the panel's just addressed with that last question. So maybe any questions? Yeah.
Caitlin. So I'm thinking through my question as I'm talking, which is never a good idea for me. But I was starting to think, as you were talking about journalists, and I suppose their integrity and the duty that they owe to survivors in telling their story, but also the way that public then consume that. And as you were talking, I was very much thinking about this idea of, it's almost like survivor stories or victim stories become public consumption and public entertainment, with this weird space that we have between, or this overlap with this current point in time, but also the popularity of true crime and things like that. Can you speak a little bit to that, or I guess that duty that is owed not just from journalists, but the general public in the way that they morally consume survivor stories?
I'm just typing the question in the chat in case they can't hear it.
Okay, that's a really good question. I'll throw to these guys, but I just want to add, it's not just journalists. I mean, I did kind of throw journalists a little bit, but it's academics too. Like, it's all of us, and like we all write about survivor stories, and sometimes I don't know that that's always good, or fair, or valid. I mean, maybe it is, like, I don't know. We also have to try and move forward, and so I appreciate everybody's asking about what next, and like, yes, this is the conversation that we want to be having, right? Where are we going next? But it's hard to navigate. It's really hard to navigate, because what do we, we don't have a right to someone's story, someone's lived experience. But then also these people want us to use it to advocate for change. So that's why I think working together, the collective, is best, because it's best of both. And permission is good. It's good stuff. Permission, asking, consent.
I think true crime is a really interesting point, because I don't know if it has desensitized people, or like I don't know what the kind of idea behind it is, but I think people do forget that there are human beings involved in these stories. They kind of see it, and I think we spoke like very strongly to the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case. Like that was a fact-finding mission. It was a fun group activity that we could all do on the internet. It wasn't a court case. It was like a DIY, make it yourself little crochet book. It was a fun thing for us to do. And I think true crime really has to answer some hard questions about how it discusses real people's real lives. And that is, usually centered around, murders or serial killers or very sensationalist things. But there's only so much content in the world, and it has to trickle down somewhere. And so it's beginning to trickle down into, I'll find out the real story of this because I'm an internet sleuth and whatever. And I think, the way that a journalist treats a story goes some of the way to addressing that. So I think you can tell when a story is told with care, it's heard with care, and and it's given back to you with care, and you can tell when it's not.
So the other week, I just did an interview, and I won't say with who because it's coming out soon, but the journalist that I spoke to reached out to me, I think 2 days later or a day later, to call me to check in to see how I was doing. And I said to her, that was the first time in however many years of however many articles or interviews I've done that someone had reached out and actually just checked in to see how I was. And I was like, oh my goodness, you're so lovely. And we just had a moment where she couldn't, she was so shocked that was the first time. But that's the nature of it. You know, it is a very transactional thing. And it's almost like, sometimes I get so frustrated at this phenomenon where I don't think journalists sometimes realise that we don't seek to gain off it, but we don't seek to gain from doing this. Like a lot of what I do is unpaid. A lot of what public survivors do is unpaid. We don't get paid to do the work that we do or the labour that we do. We do a lot of what we do and cop a lot of online hate in response and backlash. We have to deal with the emotional trauma and the pushback, and it's undervalued. And you know, in the case of my situation, you know, this adversely affects my employability. It's not something that I don't aspire for this huge profile. It's like it only seeks to hurt me emotionally, and it's sometimes this notion of they're doing us a favor by giving us a voice, but it's like, no, I'm trying to do good. That's really what it is. Like, it's not about you're giving me a favor. Like, I think there's a whole just lack of understanding of why it is that survivors do the work that they do. And I think in terms of the horrible treatment and I guess the dehumanization of public survivors in particular, we see that obviously in a lot of the memes that are created. It's like horrific online culture. But I think it also goes back to public survivors and the fact that what we do, you can't really sometimes quantify or you can't really quantify what we do. But if you were to try and measure, I mean, I don't know, maybe you can, but if you were to measure how much this has helped lives or helped reduce, I don't know, hospital costs or the mental health implications, or what are the actual measurable benefits to the work of public survivors, if we fully were to appreciate that, then I think people wouldn't be so quick to dehumanize us. I think there is such an undervalue that's placed on us and undervalue of the impact that we do. And that's just the reality. And I think until we can kind of reckon with that, we're going to continue to see that horrific dehumanization of public survivors.
We do have a question from someone online, and I think that you've all kind of alluded to this in some way across the evening. The question is the use of survivors selective? For example, who they know, so only certain high-profile ones get heard. And also, this is a question about, in the same question about clarification, when we're talking about gatekeepers, are we talking about, you know, peak bodies, policymakers? Yeah, so I guess, yeah, the first question is there like a kind of a selective process around which survivors might be the go-to people, and also to just a clarification around what do we mean by gatekeepers? I'm just you're right there.
I think it's definitely, those probably relate to each other really, because there's definitely some people have heard, some people are not. There's different people responsible for that. I think academics are responsible for that, journalists are responsible for that, the public is responsible for that. To use the Let Us Speak example, the Let Us Speak campaign, or the Let Us Speak / Let Her Speak campaign genre has supported 17 survivors. one of whom is Grace Tang. I doubt anybody knows any of the names of the other survivors. And it wouldn't be your fault, but they didn't win an Australian of the Year. Some of them look different, right? So they're not all white, they're not all able-bodied, and those things have really played into some of the reactions of the public to their stories. And it's like the story, when it comes out, might get great hits, right? You know, everybody reads it and everyone knows about it and they talk about it for a week and then that's it. You know, we're still talking about Grace Tang, rightly so. When was that? A long time later, a couple of years later, right? But we're not about others. So, and in terms of gatekeepers, I think lots of people gatekeep, right? Like technically I gatekeep you because people email the Sarah admin and then I see it and then I forward them to unless they're going to traumatize or forward to her, right? Like, so I think it depends. Like, lots of people gatekeep. Depends, yeah.
Power is a gatekeeper, isn't it?
Yeah. And people come to me like and go, "Will you and Saxon do this?" Well, I don't know. I've CC'd her in. I heard, like, you know. So in that sense, you know, we're kind of can all be a gatekeeper, but you two might have different perspectives. So, India.
What's the first question?
Like a go-to survivor.
Oh,
You know, as I said, the high-profile ones who are courting the attention of these gatekeepers as such.
I think definitely yes. Like, I think, you know, if a journalist has a Rolodex of survivor numbers, they're in their order of preference. And it starts at the top. I assume every time I get a call, it's because Grace Tang didn't answer the phone. But yeah, like I think it goes in order of kind of what I was talking about before of the easiest story to tell to the hardest story to tell. So if they just want a quote from you, you know, when that, you know, the milkshake ads came out, they wanted a quote from someone. And so they were like, oh, whose story is the easiest to sort of combine into one sentence? So we don't have to do a whole, like, oh, this is what happened to them, blah, 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 blah. And with them, we quote. So it's about, again, it's that transactional relationship with the journalist. Whose story can I tell the easiest and the quickest to get a quote in here so I can get this out if I can.
Yeah, pretty much what I think has been said. Yeah, there definitely is, you know, go-to survivors and high-profile survivors. You know, maybe image-based sexual abuse or deep fakes in Australia or wherever, you know, I might in some small way reserve that part because I'm already well known in that space, and so I have to acknowledge that privilege. And I definitely think, and I try and do what I can to make sure that other voices are heard as well. But what I would say is that specifically in the context of the media. In other contexts, maybe panels like this or advisory committees, it is always, I'm filling in for someone, like, you know, that example, I'm filling in for someone, or I'm having to fight to be that survivor representation to make sure that there is, not because I was invited or I was given the opportunity. I had to fight for a seat at the table that wasn't built for people like me. So this idea of there might be a higher presence of certain survivors, there could be another element to it, which is, you know, at least in my case, I have to fight because I'm not given that opportunity, and I have to ask and go out of my way and just receive the breadcrumbs until I reach a point where, you know, voices like mine or voices like others that are like me are just heard in every kind of aspect, rather than we have to do extra work that other people who might do less don't have to do, or other people who embody certain bodies don't have to do. So yeah.
I'm going to ask a controversial question, perhaps. And thank you to everyone on the panel, by the way. That was a really, an honour to hear you all speak. So I want to preface this by saying that I, am also someone who has been involved in law reform processes and will probably continue to do so, just to make it clear that I'm asking this in good faith. But, I guess I'm also increasingly skeptical of the willingness and capacity of the law to change. And I actually think that our criminal legal system has shown us repeatedly that it's quite unwilling to change in the face of at times very progressive reforms. We know that this system continues to be a site of harm for survivors, and it continues to be a site of colonial violence, of racist violence, of anti-queer violence. And the question I ask myself, and that I'm going to pose to you, is why do we keep coming back to this system and expect that it's going to change? Why do what's your investment in law reform?
I think all you focus on is law reform. Like your whole everything you do, your advocacy, your work, everything is about law reform, and the scope goes no further. Then I do think you are probably wasting your time. You may change certain things, you may change certain aspects, but I've said this before, but if all you do is change law reform, we are continuing to play violins while the Titanic sinks. So it cannot just be a single pronged approach. You need to hit everything all at once. So we strive for law reform because the law still exists and we still have to work within that system. And survivors, whether or not we change this, will still go, certain survivors will still go to the police. There will still be survivors who go to our justice system. So we have to try and make that as good as we can make it, while understanding that it is fraught with problems in every sense of the word, in every aspect of it. And so we have to work on the other things like education and community response and building those other things so that when this inevitably fails, there is somewhere else to go.
Yeah. It's a good question, Bianca. And I knew you and like, I think just sort of building on what Saxon said, we also advocate for comprehensive relationships and sexuality education, cradle to grave. That's just less spicy because we just call that consent education now, the bar on the floor. It's a moment that we're having a moment around consent that gives us an opportunity to try and advocate for, well, we're advocating for affirmative consent. Pick that. So there's a time for that, and I think we have this conversation, like I'm going to say once a week, that it is beating your head against a brick wall sometimes. But as long as there are survivors reporting to police, which there are, and there increasingly are, we owe it to survivors to try and make a system that won't harm them, that won't hurt so much. Now, I agree, we're probably never going to get there. We actually need like a suite of responses and pathways to the elusive idea of justice, sort of drawing on some of the conversations that we had today. But so certainly like law reform is not the only thing we're advocating for. We're also, asking for a change of system, but also, innovative justice mechanisms that sit outside that system. Hopefully we get to a stage where that happens. But at the moment, there's a time for consent to shift. If you know my work, I'm very skeptical of affirmative consent anyway, and its potential. Like I've really criticised it now. I'm an advocate. It's like it's slightly better than what we have, but it's certainly not the silver bullet. And we want less cases having to go to court because less sexual violence happens. Like we want to retire by 40, because sexual violence doesn't exist. And we don't go home. We don't need to be here. Like that's the dream, but and this won't do that. But hopefully the suite of things we're doing maybe will get us a bit closer.
Yeah, well, I feel a lot of sometimes the feelings that you feel. I get into the pits of despair all the time, and I get so angry and so frustrated at the performative nature of politics, the apathy, the hypocrisy, who's listened to, who's not, how much more work you feel you have to do versus other people. So so I feel that deeply. But there's something that Clementine Ford had actually talked about in one of her posts that she made, and I thought it was really, really powerful and it resonated with me in terms of why I try and do and continue on with the advocacy for law reform, which is that, I'm paraphrasing here, but she talks about this idea of not, we might never see the fruits of our labour in this lifetime. We might never sit under that tree and enjoy it, but people who come after us will, and those I guess changes will come on the backs of the work. So we have to keep trying, even if we don't see it, because we have to do it for the next generation. So I just thought that really resonated with me, where if I'm feeling that way, I just feel like I have to keep going.
I have one last question.
I feel like that was such a nice way to end. I'm tempted not to ask my question, but if I can, I want to start by thanking you for giving us your stories. And my question is for Noelle, if I can ask you a question about race. Because you've all spoken about this pressure to turn up as an archetypal victim, and Noelle, it sounds like you've been excluded from the space because you don't fit, but I wanted to ask you, are you ever forced to turn up as the woman of colour survivor? And when you just want to turn up as you? And I suppose I asked the question because we're passing on responsibilities. We went, AGs, journalists, academics, true crime makers, and then I also think there's an accountability for women of colour groups when we want people to speak for us when they may just not want to speak with that identity in that moment. So has that been an experience for you?
Yeah, the one thing that I think of is something that I do feel ashamed in terms of how I've gone about a lot of the activism that I've done. So one of the biggest questions or primary questions that a lot of journalists ask me or people ask me about my experiences is, why did they target you? Why did the perpetrators target you? And it's something that it's like, oh my goodness, you have to sit there and justify why anonymous sexual predators had gone and doctored images of me into pornography and created fake pornographic videos of me. So I have to feel in that moment, in order to allow other people to understand or digest why something like that could happen to me, I have to almost fetishize my body type or even my ethnicity in order for other people to have the light bulb go off to understand why something like this could happen to me, because I don't fit the mold of that happening to someone, and I have to almost reduce myself into a fetish and say that word in order for people and the broader community to understand. So that degrades me, and I think it also degrades people who look like me. And I have to figure out better language to use, but I do that because it just is easier. So I don't have to deal with people's judgments and perceptions of trying to figure out why something like this could happen to me. And so that's just one way I think I thought of when it's not really the perfect response to that question, but it's something that I have to feel that I have to fit as being a woman of colour who doesn't fit the ideal victim mould. And I wonder whether that's a question that other people would have to get if they weren't women of colour. Are you constantly asked why you were sexually assaulted? Are other people asked why were you harmed online? But I was, because it's people can't really figure it out on their own. I have to literally explain to them.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the panel. Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences, your reflections, your insights.
Been incredibly generous.
Very generous. It's a real privilege to be here to bear witness to your experiences and your knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing. And thank you to those of you who are online Let's thank our panelists for this.